The blood-red sky stretched across the horizon like a wounded animal as Ruby Anderson rode into the small, dusty town of Wilson, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1875. She'd traveled over 700 miles with nothing but a small satchel of belongings and the clothes on her back, fleeing a past that seemed to chase her like a shadow. The town looked like every other frontier settlement she'd passed through, wooden buildings with false fronts lining the main street, horses tied to hitching posts, and men in dusty boots eyeing her with curiosity as she guided her exhausted mare toward what appeared to be a livery stable. Ruby's golden red hair was tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her green eyes scanning the buildings for a place to stay. Her dress, once a fine blue cotton, was now travel-worn and coated with the dust of the trail. At 22, she'd seen enough hardship to know that Wilson wasn't likely to be the paradise she sought, but it might offer what she needed most: anonymity. The livery stable appeared busier than expected for a town of this size. As Ruby approached, she noticed a tall figure moving with purpose among the horses. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn leather vest, and his movements spoke of someone who understood animals on an instinctive level. "Excuse me," Ruby called out, her voice slightly hoarse from the dust of the trail. "I need to board my horse for a few days." The man turned, and Ruby felt an unexpected jolt when their eyes met. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and eyes the color of a summer storm. A thin scar ran along his jawline, adding character to an already striking face. "Name's Reed Ainsworth," he said, approaching her mare with an easy confidence. "Just passing through or planning to stay a while? I haven't decided yet," Ruby answered cautiously. "Is there a boarding house in town that's respectable?" Reed's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he nodded. "Mrs. Hollister runs a clean place 2 streets over. Tell her I sent you." He reached up to help her dismount, and Ruby hesitated before accepting his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. "I'm Ruby Anderson," she said, releasing his hand quickly. "You've come a long way, Miss Anderson," he observed, noting her mare's condition. "This girl needs a good rest and some quality feed." "I can pay," Ruby said quickly, reaching for her small coin purse. Reed shook his head. "We'll settle up when you know how long you're staying." He began untacking her horse with practiced efficiency. "Wilson's not much, but it's growing. The silver mines up in the hills are bringing in new folks every month." Ruby nodded, not yet ready to share her own story. "Thank you, Mr. Ainsworth. Most folks call me Reed," he said, offering a small smile that transformed his face. "Mr. Ainsworth was my father, and I never much cared for him anyway." Before Ruby could respond, a commotion at the far end of the stable drew their attention. A young boy, no more than 12, came running in, his face flushed with urgency. "Reed, come quick. The Brennan family just rolled in from Durango. Their wagon broke an axle outside town, and Mrs. Brennan's having her baby. Doc's out at the Peterson place, and they got 3 little ones with them, half frozen in this cold." Reed immediately turned to Ruby. "Sorry to cut this short, Miss Anderson. Directions to Mrs. Hollister's are simple: head down Main Street, take your second right, white house with blue shutters." Without thinking, Ruby spoke. "I can help. I know about birthing babies." Reed paused, studying her face. "You sure about that?" "I was a midwife's assistant back east," she said, the partial truth coming easily. "Well then, looks like Wilson just got the help it needed," Reed said, already moving toward the stable door. "Can you ride double? It'll be faster than walking." 10 minutes later, Ruby found herself holding onto Reed's waist as they galloped toward the outskirts of town. The wind whipped against her face, and despite the urgency of the situation, she couldn't help but notice the solid strength of the man she clung to. It had been a long time since she'd trusted a stranger, but something about Reed Ainsworth's direct gaze told her he was a man of his word. They reached the stranded wagon just as the sun dipped below the mountains. A man with worried eyes stood beside the broken vehicle, while 3 small children huddled together near a pitiful excuse for a fire. Inside the wagon, a woman's groan made it clear that the baby wouldn't wait for formalities. Thomas Brennan, the man introduced himself hurriedly. My Olivia's been having pain since morning. The wheel broke and now she says the baby's coming fast. Ruby didn't waste time with words. She slid from the horse and moved directly to the wagon, where a pale young woman lay on a makeshift pallet, her face contorted with pain. I'm Ruby, she said softly, touching the woman's forehead. I'm going to help you bring this baby into the world. Olivia Brennan nodded weakly, too exhausted to question this stranger's appearance. Outside the wagon, Reed had already taken charge of the situation. Ruby could hear him directing Thomas to gather more wood for the fire. Those children need warmth, she heard Reed say, his voice carrying in the chill air. Ruby worked quickly, checking Olivia's progress while maintaining a calm demeanor. The woman was indeed close to delivering, but something wasn't quite right. The baby seemed to be in an awkward position. After ensuring Olivia was comfortable for the moment, Ruby stepped outside to speak with Reed. The children were now gathered close to a much larger fire, wrapped in blankets that Reed must have brought from his saddlebags. The babies turned sideways, Ruby explained quietly. I can help, but I'll need hot water and clean cloths, and those children need more than just a fire to keep them warm through the night. Reed nodded, his expression grave in the firelight. They need warmth, he said, looking at the shivering children. Ruby found herself responding before she could consider her words. Then let me be fire and home, she whispered, surprising herself with the intensity of her declaration. Get me what I need for the mother, and I'll make sure these little ones are cared for. Something shifted in Reed's eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to be needed. Without another word, he turned to Thomas and began organizing what Ruby required. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of activity. Ruby divided her attention between coaching Olivia through an increasingly difficult labor and checking on the children, who gradually warmed up as Reed constructed a lean-to beside the fire to block the night wind. Thomas alternated between helping Reed and comforting his wife, his face drawn with worry. Just after midnight, with the stars bright overhead, Olivia Brennan gave birth to a healthy baby boy. His first cry split the night air, strong and defiant against the odds. You have a son, Ruby announced, wrapping the infant in the cleanest cloth they had available. The look of wonder on Thomas's face as he held his child made something clench in Ruby's chest, a reminder of all she'd lost and fled from. With mother and baby resting, Ruby joined Reed by the fire where the 3 Brennan children had finally fallen asleep, curled together like puppies. You're good with children, Reed observed, handing her a cup of coffee he'd brewed over the flames. Ruby accepted the hot drink gratefully. I had a younger brother, she said, the past tense revealing more than she intended. Reed didn't press. Instead, he said, I've got a wagon coming at first light to get them all to town. Thomas says they're planning to settle in Wilson. He's a carpenter by trade. They'll need help until Olivia's back on her feet, Ruby said, staring into the dancing flames. Looks like Wilson just got itself a new midwife, too, Reed replied, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied her face. Ruby tensed. I didn't say I was staying. Didn't say you weren't, either. Reed's voice held no pressure, just a simple observation that made Ruby wonder if perhaps she'd found a place worth stopping at least for a while. By morning, Ruby had helped settle the Brennan family into a small vacant cabin on the edge of town that Reed had arranged for them. The generosity of the townspeople surprised her. Within hours, food and supplies had been delivered, along with offers of work for Thomas, Mrs. Hollister, the boarding house owner, had indeed taken Ruby in on Reed's recommendation, though she'd eyed Ruby's worn dress and single bag with barely concealed curiosity. Any friend of Reed Ainsworth's is welcome here, the older woman had said. That young man has done more for this town than most who have lived here all their lives. Over the next few days, Ruby found herself pulled into the rhythm of Wilson. She visited Olivia Brennan daily, helping with the newborn and the other children. She learned that Reed wasn't actually the livery owner, but the town's unofficial problem solver. He worked as a horse trainer, occasional lawman, and whatever else Wilson needed. A week after her arrival, Ruby was returning from the Brennans when Reed fell into step beside her on the wooden sidewalk. "Town's talking about you," he said without preamble. Ruby's heart quickened with alarm. "What are they saying?" "That you've got a healing touch, Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism is better after you made that willow bark tea, and everyone's seen how well the Brennan baby is doing, even after that difficult birth." Relief flooded through Ruby. "People talk too much in small towns." "That they do," Reed agreed with a slight smile. "Speaking of talking, there's a social at the church tomorrow evening. Thought you might like to go." Ruby hesitated. Getting involved in town life meant putting down roots she wasn't sure she could afford. "I don't know if Thomas Brennan's bringing his fiddle," Reed continued as if she hadn't spoken. "And Mrs. Hollister's been baking pies since sunrise. Seems a shame to miss it." Their steps had brought them to the door of the boarding house. Ruby paused, looking up at Reed. In the week she'd known him, she'd learned he wasn't a man to push where he wasn't wanted, which made his persistence now all the more significant. "Are you asking to escort me, Mr. Ainsworth?" she finally asked. "I believe I am, Miss Anderson," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Something warm unfurled in Ruby's chest. "Then I accept." Reed's smile was worth the risk of saying yes. "I'll call for you at 6. As he walked away, Ruby wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. She'd come to Wilson to disappear, not to stand out. Yet here she was, agreeing to attend a social on the arm of a man everyone in town seemed to respect. A man who made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she cared to remember. The church social proved to be a revelation for Ruby. The townspeople welcomed her without reservation, treating her as if she'd always been part of their community. Reed stayed by her side throughout the evening, introducing her to everyone from the mayor to the blacksmith. She danced 3 times, twice with Reed and once with Thomas Brennan, who couldn't stop thanking her for saving his wife and son. "You've made quite an impression," Reed commented as they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars. "Sheriff Matthews was asking if you'd consider setting up as the town's official midwife and healer. Seems having to ride 15 miles for Doc Jenkins is getting old." Ruby's steps slowed. "I can't stay in Wilson permanently." Reed was quiet for a moment. "Can't or won't, it's complicated." "Most worthwhile things are," Reed said, his voice gentle in the darkness. "Whatever you're running from, Ruby and I know you're running from something. Wilson might be a good place to catch your breath." Ruby stopped walking entirely, forcing Reed to turn and face her. "How do you know I'm running?" "I recognize the look," he said simply. "I wore it myself when I first came to Wilson 5 years ago." His honesty deserved her own. "There's a man back east who believes he owns me," Ruby admitted, the words feeling strange after keeping them locked inside for so long. "My father died owing him money, and he decided I would pay the debt by becoming his wife. When I refused, things got unpleasant." Reed's face hardened in the moonlight. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the memories. "I left the night before the wedding was to take place, took my father's pocket watch and what little money I could find and ran. And you think he's still looking for you?" "Oscar Blackwell doesn't give up what he considers his property," Ruby said bitterly. "He owns half the town I came from. Has connections across 3 states. Reed was silent for a long moment, processing her words. Finally, he said, "Wilson's a small place, but we take care of our own. If you decided to stay, you wouldn't be alone anymore." The offer hung between them, weighted with possibilities that Ruby hardly dared consider. "I'll think about it," she promised. As they reached the boarding house, Reed surprised her by taking her hand. His touch was warm, steady. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you've already brought more to this town in a week than most folks do in a lifetime. That's something worth protecting." Before she could respond, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly against her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that Ruby felt her breath catch. Then he was tipping his hat and walking away, leaving her standing on the porch with her hand still tingling from his touch. Inside her room, Ruby stood by the window watching Reed's figure disappear down the darkened street. She removed her father's pocket watch from its hiding place in her boot and opened the case, running her thumb over the inscription inside. "Time reveals truth," it read, her father's favorite saying. The truth was, she was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of being alone. And in just 1 week, Reed Ainsworth had somehow managed to make her feel like perhaps she didn't have to be. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house. Sheriff Matthews arrived while Ruby was helping with the breakfast dishes, his weathered face solemn beneath his silver mustache. "Miss Anderson," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into the kitchen. "Might I have a word?" Ruby's hands stilled in the soapy water, her heart instantly racing. Had Oscar found her already, Mrs. Hollister sensed her distress and immediately came to her defense. "Whatever business you have with Miss Anderson can be discussed right here, Sheriff. I won't have you scaring my help." The sheriff's expression softened. "No need for alarm, ladies. I've just come with a request. Doc Jenkins is laid up with a broken ankle, and we've got a situation out at the Miller place. Their youngest, Annie, has come down with something fierce, and Mrs. Miller is at her wit's end. Reed Ainsworth suggested you might be willing to help." Relief made Ruby's knees weak. "Of course," she said, already drying her hands. "Let me get my things." Within 20 minutes, Ruby was riding beside the sheriff toward the Miller homestead, her small collection of medicinal herbs and supplies tucked into a borrowed satchel. She'd spent years assisting the midwife in her hometown, learning which plants healed and which soothed, knowledge that had served her well during her journey west. "Reed thinks highly of you," the sheriff commented as they rode. "Says you've got a healing touch." Ruby felt a flush that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Mr. Ainsworth is generous with his praise. Reed doesn't praise what isn't deserving," Sheriff Matthews replied. "Boy's been through enough to know the measure of a person." Curiosity got the better of Ruby. "He mentioned he came to Wilson 5 years ago. Was he running from something too?" The sheriff gave her a sharp look, then seemed to decide she deserved an answer. "Reed was a cavalry scout during the war, though he was hardly more than a boy. After, he worked for the railroad, until a dispute with his foreman turned ugly. Reed defended a Chinese worker who was being beaten, and for his trouble got a knife to the face and a price on his head when the foreman died of his injuries. But if it was self-defense, the foreman had powerful friends," the sheriff said simply. "Reed came west, worked odd jobs until he landed in Wilson. Town needed someone who understood horses, and he needed somewhere to belong. Been here ever since." Ruby absorbed this information as they approached a modest homestead nestled against the foothills. The sheriff's story explained much about Reed: his watchfulness, his quiet confidence, and the way he'd recognized another fugitive in Ruby without judgment. The Miller situation proved to be less dire than feared. 9-year-old Annie was suffering from a severe chest cold that had settled in her lungs. Ruby prepared a poultice of mustard and herbs to ease her breathing, then brewed a tea with honey for the inflammation. By late afternoon, the child was breathing easier and had fallen into a natural sleep. "You've saved us a journey to fetch Doc Jenkins," Mrs. Miller said gratefully as Ruby packed her supplies. "How much do we owe you?" Ruby shook her head. "Nothing, I'm happy to help." "Nonsense," Mr. Miller interjected. "We pay our debts." He pressed several coins into Ruby's palm despite her protests. On the ride back to town, Sheriff Matthews was more talkative. "Wilson could use someone with your skills, Miss Anderson. We're growing fast with the mines bringing in new families every month. Doc Jenkins is getting on in years, and the nearest real hospital is in Denver." "I'm not a doctor," Ruby reminded him. "No, but you know more than most, and folks trust you already." He gave her a sideways glance. "Reed says you might have trouble following you." Ruby stiffened. "He shouldn't have mentioned that." He didn't give details. "Just said if anyone came asking about you, I should let him know before answering." The sheriff adjusted his hat. "Wilson takes care of its own, Miss Anderson." Something to consider. By the time they reached town, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The sheriff left Ruby at the boarding house with a tip of his hat and a reminder that his offer of a position as the town's midwife remained open. Ruby was halfway up the porch steps when she heard someone call her name. Turning, she saw Reed approaching from the direction of the livery, his long strides eating up the distance between them. "Heard you worked another miracle with the Miller girl," he said as he reached her. "Hardly a miracle. Just some herbs and common sense." Ruby brushed a strand of hair from her face, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after the long day. "Thank you for recommending me to the sheriff." Reed shrugged. "Seemed the natural thing. You helping the Brennans showed me what you could do." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you don't mind that I told Matthews to be careful if anyone came asking about you." "The sheriff mentioned that." Ruby sighed. "I should be angry, but I'm actually grateful. It's been a long time since anyone looked out for me." Something in Reed's expression changed, becoming more intent. "I'd like to continue looking out for you if you'd allow it." The directness of his statement caught Ruby off guard. "Why?" "Because from the moment I saw you ride into Wilson, I knew you were someone worth knowing," Reed said, his gaze never leaving hers. "And everything I've learned since has only confirmed it." Ruby felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Reed countered. "I know you didn't hesitate to help strangers in need. I know you have knowledge that could benefit this town. And I know that when you smile, really smile, like you did at the social when Thomas was playing his fiddle, it's like watching the sun come out after a storm." Ruby was speechless, caught between the desire to run from the intensity of his regard and the equally powerful urge to step closer to him. Reed saved her from deciding by continuing, "I'm not asking for promises, Ruby, just a chance to see what might happen if you stayed in Wilson a while longer." Before she could respond, the boarding house door opened and Mrs. Hollister peered out. "There you are, Ruby." "Supper's getting cold and you've had a caller." Ruby tensed. "A caller, young man from the telegraph office," Mrs. Hollister explained. "Said he had a message for you, but since you weren't here, he left it with me." She held out a folded piece of paper. Ruby took it with fingers that suddenly felt numb. Only one person would be sending her a telegraph. She unfolded the paper with Reed watching, his expression growing concerned as the color drained from her face. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "He's found me," Ruby whispered, the words barely audible. "Oscar Blackwell. He's in Denver and will be arriving in Wilson by the end of the week." The next morning found Ruby packing her meager belongings, her movements quick with barely controlled panic. Mrs. Hollister had tried to convince her to stay, but Ruby's mind was made up. She couldn't risk bringing Oscar Blackwell's wrath down on a town that had shown her nothing but kindness. A knock at her door made her freeze. "Who is it?" "Reed," came the response. "I need to speak with you." Ruby hesitated, then opened the door. Reed stood in the hallway, his expression grave. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You're running again," he said, eyeing her half-packed bag. "I don't have a choice," Ruby replied, turning back to her packing. "You don't know Oscar Blackwell? Then tell me about him." Reed remained standing by the door as if physically blocking her escape. "Help me understand why you're willing to throw away everything you've started to build here." Ruby sat heavily on the bed, the fight suddenly draining out of her. "Oscar Blackwell owns lumber mills in Pennsylvania. My father worked for him, invested with him. When the market crashed in '73, my father lost everything. He took his own life rather than face the shame." Reed's expression softened with sympathy, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "Blackwell came to the funeral and informed me that my father had left debts totaling over $2,000. He said he'd forgive the debt if I agreed to marry him." Ruby's voice hardened. "I was 18, alone and terrified. He was 45 and had already buried 2 wives. "You refused him," Reed guessed. Ruby nodded. "At first, but he was persistent. Began spreading rumors that my father had embezzled from the company. Said he could have me thrown in prison as an accomplice. Eventually, I agreed to the marriage just to stop the gossip that was destroying what was left of my father's reputation." "What changed your mind?" "I overheard him talking to his business partner the night before the wedding." He was boasting about how he'd forged documents to make it appear my father owed him money. Ruby's hands clenched into fists. It had all been a lie to force me into marriage, so I took what little I could carry and ran. Reed crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I've been running for 8 months," Ruby continued. "I've stayed in a dozen towns, never more than a few weeks, always looking over my shoulder, but this time—" She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This time I let myself believe I might have found somewhere to belong." Reed reached out slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, and covered her clenched fist with his hand. "You have found somewhere to belong, here in Wilson. You don't understand. Blackwell won't just take me and leave. He'll want to punish anyone who helped me. He's not a forgiving man." "Neither am I," Reed said, his voice low and determined. "And Wilson isn't some eastern town where money buys justice. We handle things differently here." Ruby shook her head. "I won't put you or anyone else in danger." Reed's grip on her hand tightened. "Did it ever occur to you that running is exactly what he expects? That perhaps the best way to end this is to stand your ground with people who will stand beside you?" The concept was so foreign to Ruby's recent experience that she could only stare at him. "Why would anyone stand with me against a man like Blackwell? Because that's what we do in Wilson," Reed said simply, "and because I've seen the way Mrs. Hollister fusses over you like the daughter she never had. I've seen how the Brennan children light up when you visit. I've seen the respect in Sheriff Matthews' eyes when he talks about your healing skills." He paused, then added more softly, "And I've seen the woman who whispered then, 'Let me be fire and home,' when children needed warmth in the cold night." Ruby remembered those words, spoken in a moment of unguarded compassion. She'd meant them then, had felt the fierce protectiveness rise in her when she'd seen those shivering children. Perhaps Reed was right. Perhaps running wasn't the answer this time. "What do you suggest?" she asked finally. Relief flickered across Reed's face. "First, you unpack that bag. Then we talk to Sheriff Matthews and make a plan. Blackwell may think he's coming to claim a frightened girl, but he's going to find a community instead." For the first time since receiving the telegram, Ruby felt a spark of hope. "And if he has legal documents, if he truly can make a case that I stole from him when I left, then we'll face that too," Reed promised. "But together, not with you alone on the road." Ruby looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Reed's face. The determination she saw there gave her courage. "All right," she said. "I'll stay and face him." Reed's smile transformed his face, making him look younger and untroubled. "That's my brave Ruby," he said, the possessive sending an unexpected thrill through her. Over the next 3 days, Wilson prepared for Oscar Blackwell's arrival like a town readying for battle. Sheriff Matthews sent telegrams to contacts in Denver and Pennsylvania, gathering information about the man who threatened one of their own. What he learned only confirmed Ruby's account. Blackwell had a reputation for ruthlessness in business, and had indeed been engaged to Ruby after her father's death. Thomas Brennan, grateful for Ruby's help with his family, offered his carpentry skills to help reinforce the door and windows of Ruby's room at the boarding house. Mrs. Hollister declared that Ruby would not be working during this time, but would be treated as a proper guest, giving her time to prepare mentally for the confrontation to come. And Reed barely left her side. He escorted her on walks through town, took her on a picnic beside the creek that wound its way through the valley, and spent evenings on the boarding house porch talking about everything from books to horses to their hopes for the future. Ruby found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone since before her father's death. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her mother's passing when she was 12, and her father's subsequent withdrawal into grief that had left Ruby essentially raising herself. In return, Reed shared stories of his own youth in Missouri, his time as a cavalry scout during the war when he was barely 16, and the years of drifting afterward, searching for somewhere that felt like home. Wilson had been that place for him, and listening to him talk about the town and its people, Ruby began to believe it might become that for her as well. The evening before Blackwell was expected to arrive, Reed took Ruby to dinner at Wilson's only restaurant, a small establishment attached to the hotel that served surprisingly good food. They had just finished their meal when Reed reached across the table and took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, his voice low and intense, "I want you to know that meeting you has been the best thing to happen to me since I came to Wilson." Ruby felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I feel the same," she admitted. "I just wish we'd met under different circumstances." "I don't," Reed said, surprising her. "If Blackwell hadn't driven you from your home, you'd never have come west. We'd never have met. Sometimes the worst events of our lives lead us to the best." As they walked back to the boarding house, Ruby felt a curious sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring a confrontation she had dreaded for months. Yet now, with Reed beside her and the support of Wilson behind her, she found she was more angry than afraid. "What will you do after tomorrow?" Reed asked as they reached Mrs. Hollister's porch. Ruby considered the question. "If things go as we hope and Blackwell leaves without me, I think I'd like to accept the sheriff's offer to become the town's midwife. Mrs. Brennan has offered to help me find a small place of my own." Reed nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds like a good plan. And you?" Ruby asked, suddenly nervous about his answer. "What will you do once this is over?" Reed's smile was slow and certain. "I'll be right here helping the new town midwife settle in, if she'll have me." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond their simple arrangement. Ruby found herself stepping closer to him, drawn by the warmth in his eyes. "She'd like that very much," she whispered. Reed's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle for a man who had known so much hardship. "Ruby Anderson," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "May I kiss you?" In answer, Ruby rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question being asked and answered between them. Then Reed's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise. When they finally parted, Ruby was breathless, her heart racing in her chest. Reed looked equally affected, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. "I should go in," Ruby said reluctantly. Reed nodded, though he made no move to release her. "Tomorrow will be difficult," he warned. "Blackwell won't give up easily." "I know," Ruby agreed, "but neither will I." Oscar Blackwell arrived on the afternoon stage, exactly as his telegram had promised. Ruby watched from the sheriff's office window as a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit stepped down from the coach. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "That's him," she said unnecessarily. Sheriff Matthews and Reed both stood beside her, watching Blackwell retrieve his luggage and speak to the stage driver. "Looks like he's planning a stay," the sheriff observed, noting the large trunk being unloaded. "I'll have Deputy Collins keep an eye on him, see where he goes first." They didn't have long to wait. After checking into the hotel, Blackwell headed straight for the telegraph office, emerging 10 minutes later with an expression of irritation that was visible even from a distance. "He's heading this way," Reed said, moving protectively closer to Ruby. Sheriff Matthews nodded. "Remember the plan." "Let me do the talking at first." When Blackwell entered the sheriff's office, he seemed momentarily taken aback to find 3 people waiting for him. His eyes quickly found Ruby, and his expression shifted from surprise to a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ruby, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "You've led me on quite a chase." "Mr. Blackwell," Ruby acknowledged, proud that her voice remained steady. Blackwell turned his attention to the sheriff. "I assume you're the local law enforcement. I'm Oscar Blackwell from Pennsylvania. I've come to retrieve my fiancé." Sheriff Matthews leaned back against his desk, his posture deceptively casual. "That right. Seems to me Miss Anderson doesn't appear eager to be retrieved." Blackwell's smile tightened. "I'm afraid Ruby has been somewhat confused since her father's death. She agreed to marry me, then disappeared the night before our wedding, taking family heirlooms and a substantial amount of cash." "That's a lie," Ruby said, her anger overcoming her fear. "I took nothing but my father's pocket watch, which was left to me in his will, and $17 of my own savings." Now, Ruby," Blackwell said, his tone patronizing. "We both know that's not true. I have documents proving the theft." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced several folded papers. "I've been quite patient, allowing you time to come to your senses, but my patience has limits." Sheriff Matthews accepted the papers and studied them carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "These appear to be in order," he said finally. "However, I've received some interesting telegrams from Pennsylvania myself. Seems there's some question about your business dealings, Mr. Blackwell, particularly regarding your treatment of the Anderson estate." Blackwell's confidence faltered slightly. "Whatever rumors you've heard are just that rumors spread by business rivals." "Maybe so," the sheriff agreed, "but they're enough to make me reluctant to simply hand Miss Anderson over to you, especially since she's become a valued member of our community." For the first time, Blackwell seemed to really notice Reed, who had remained silently watching the exchange. "And who might you be?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "Reed Ainsworth," Reed replied, his voice level. "Miss Anderson's friend." Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he assessed the younger man, clearly recognizing a threat. "How touching," he said coldly, "but friendship doesn't override legal obligations. Ruby agreed to marry me in exchange for forgiveness of her father's debts. She then stole from me and fled. I have every right to demand her return and the repayment of what she took." "I never stole from you," Ruby insisted, "and I only agreed to marry you because you threatened to destroy my father's reputation with lies." "Your word against mine, my dear," Blackwell said with a shrug. "And I have documentation. What do you have?" "She has us," Reed said quietly. The simple statement seemed to fill the room. Blackwell's expression hardened. "I've dealt with interference before, Mr. Ainsworth. It rarely ends well for those who stand in my way." "Is that a threat?" Sheriff Matthews asked mildly. "A statement of fact," Blackwell replied. "I've come for what's mine, and I won't leave without it." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Brennan, who entered the sheriff's office with a purposeful stride. "Sheriff," he said, nodding to the others, "I've got that information you requested." Matthews raised an eyebrow. "Already, that was fast work." "Telegraph operator in Denver is my wife's cousin," Thomas explained. "He was happy to help." He handed over a telegram, which the sheriff read with evident satisfaction. "Well now, Mr. Blackwell," Matthews said, looking up from the paper, "it seems your business in Pennsylvania is experiencing some difficulties. The bank in Pittsburgh has some questions about certain financial irregularities. They're quite eager to speak with you." Blackwell's face drained of color. "That's impossible." "Apparently not," the sheriff countered. "According to this, they've been trying to locate you for weeks." "Something about misappropriated funds and falsified loan documents." He looked pointedly at Ruby. "Sound familiar?" Ruby felt a surge of vindication. "You did the same thing to others that you tried to do to my father, didn't you? Created false debts to gain control of their assets." Blackwell's composure cracked. "This is absurd. I won't be accused by a girl who barely understands business, a backwater sheriff, and he glared at Reed, a nobody. Reed stepped forward, his patience visibly fraying. "Miss Anderson isn't leaving with you, Blackwell. Not today, not ever. Whatever game you were playing back east has caught up with you. I suggest you leave Wilson while you still can." "Or what?" Blackwell sneered. "Or I'll be forced to detain you until authorities from Pennsylvania can arrive," Sheriff Matthews said. "I understand they're quite interested in asking you some questions in person." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds. Ruby could see the calculations happening behind Blackwell's eyes, weighing his options, looking for leverage and finding none. "This isn't over," he said finally, his gaze settling on Ruby with cold fury. "You've made a powerful enemy today, my dear." "I made that enemy the day I refused to be your property," Ruby replied, finding strength in the truth. "The difference is now I'm not facing you alone." Blackwell's jaw tightened. Without another word, he turned and stalked from the office, the door slamming behind him. The tension in the room eased slightly, but Ruby knew better than to believe the confrontation was truly over. "He won't give up that easily," she said. Sheriff Matthews nodded. "No, he won't, but neither will we." Thomas, spread the word I want eyes on Blackwell every minute he remains in Wilson. Already done, Thomas assured him. Half the town is watching and waiting. Reed turned to Ruby, concern etched on his features. Are you all right? Better than I expected, she admitted. Seeing him again, it was frightening, but also freeing. He doesn't have the power over me that he once did. Reed's smile was fierce with pride. No, he doesn't, and he never will again. The confrontation with Blackwell marked a turning point for Ruby. Though she remained cautious, watching for signs of his retaliation, she also began to truly settle into life in Wilson. She officially accepted the position as town midwife and healer, setting up a small practice in a room behind the general store that the owner, Mr. Tate, offered at her reduced rent. Reed helped her build shelves for her herbs and medicines, working alongside her in the evenings after his duties at the livery were complete. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, moving from friendship to something neither of them had yet put into words, though it was evident to everyone in town. A week after Blackwell's arrival, he was still in Wilson, staying at the hotel and making daily trips to the telegraph office. Ruby caught glimpses of him occasionally, but he made no attempt to approach her directly. His presence was like a dark cloud on the horizon, concerning, but no longer immediately threatening. What do you think he's waiting for? Ruby asked Reed one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. The October night was cool, and Reed had brought a blanket that they now shared, their shoulders touching as they watched the stars appear above the mountains. Reinforcements, maybe, Reed suggested. Or he's trying to salvage whatever business problems he's having back east. Ruby nodded, leaning slightly into his warmth. The sheriff received another telegram today. The bank in Pittsburgh has issued a warrant for Blackwell's arrest. They've sent someone to retrieve him. Reed looked down at her, surprised. You didn't mention that earlier. I only just heard. Sheriff Matthews came by the practice this afternoon. Ruby sighed. I should feel relieved, but instead I'm just tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next crisis. Reed's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her closer. Maybe it's time to start looking forward instead. There was something in his tone that made Ruby's heart quicken. What do you mean? Reed shifted to face her, his expression suddenly serious. I've been thinking about the future, my future, our future, if you're willing. Ruby's breath caught. Reed, let me finish, he said gently. I know we've only known each other a short time. I know you came to Wilson running from a man who tried to force you into marriage. The last thing I want is to make you feel pressured or trapped. You could never make me feel that way, Ruby assured him. Reed smiled, reaching up to touch her cheek. What I'm trying to say, not very elegantly, is that I've fallen in love with you, Ruby Anderson. I love your courage, your compassion, your fierce determination to help others even when you're facing your own battles. Ruby felt tears spring to her eyes at his declaration. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. I think I started falling for you the moment you said they need warmth, and I answered without thinking. Then let me be fire and home, Reed quoted, his voice husky with emotion. I knew then that you were someone special, someone who understood what it means to create safety for others, even when you've never had it yourself. Ruby leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. You've become my home, Reed Ainsworth, the first real home I've had since my father died. Reed's kiss was gentle, reverent, as if he were sealing a sacred promise between them. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I'm not asking for marriage, not yet, he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. But I am asking if you'll consider a future with me, when you're ready, when all this business with Blackwell is truly behind us. Ruby stared at the ring, its beauty lying in its simplicity and the sincerity with which it was offered. It's beautiful, she said, touching it lightly. It was my mother's, Reed explained. The only thing of hers I managed to hold onto through the years of wandering. I'd like you to have it as a promise. A promise of what? Ruby asked, her voice barely audible. That you'll never have to face anything alone again, Reed said. That whatever life brings, we'll meet it together. Ruby extended her left hand, her decision made with absolute certainty. Yes, she said simply. Reed slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. The moment was so perfect that neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street, his face twisted with rage at the scene unfolding before him. The next morning brought news that sent a chill through Wilson. Oscar Blackwell had checked out of the hotel before dawn, leaving no word of his destination. Sheriff Matthews organized search parties to check the roads leading out of town, concerned that Blackwell might attempt to ambush Ruby if she traveled to outlying homesteads for her work. "I don't think he's left the area," Reed said grimly as he joined Ruby at her practice late that morning. "A man like Blackwell doesn't admit defeat easily." Ruby touched the ring on her finger, drawing strength from its presence. "What do you think he's planning?" Before Reed could answer, the door opened and Mrs. Hollister hurried in, her face flushed with exertion. "Ruby, there's a woman at the boarding house asking for you. Says her sister's in labor with her first child, complicated birth. They need you right away." Ruby immediately began gathering her supplies. "Where are they located?" "Cabin about 3 miles north of town, Mrs. Hollister said, wringing her hands. "The woman Martha, she said her name was she rode all the way in by herself, leaving her sister with only her husband." Reed frowned. "I don't recall any new settlers to the north. Who is this family?" Mrs. Hollister shook her head. "She didn't say. Just that they arrived last week and haven't had time to meet many people. Her sister wasn't due for another month, she said, but the baby's coming early." A sense of unease prickled at the back of Ruby's neck. "Did Sheriff Matthews find any sign of Blackwell on the North Road?" "I don't believe they've checked there yet," Mrs. Hollister replied. "They focused on the main roads to Denver and Durango." Reed and Ruby exchanged a look of shared suspicion. "I'll go with you," Reed said immediately. "Martha said to come alone," Mrs. Hollister added. "Said her sister's nervous around strangers, especially men. With the birth being difficult, she didn't want to upset her further." "It could be innocent," Ruby said, though her instincts were screaming otherwise, "or it could be a trap," Reed countered. "Blackwell trying to get you alone, away from town." Ruby considered their options. "If it is a trap, we need to spring it carefully, but if it's truly a woman in need, I can't ignore her." Reed nodded, already forming a plan. "We'll both go, but separately. I'll follow at a distance, make sure you reach the cabin safely. And if it's Blackwell," Ruby asked, Reed's expression hardened, "then he'll regret his decision to stay in Wilson." Within 20 minutes, Ruby was riding north, her medical supplies packed securely in saddlebags. She had seen the woman who called herself Martha, a thin, nervous individual who had hurried back to her sister as soon as Ruby assured her she would come. Nothing about the woman had seemed obviously suspicious, yet Ruby couldn't shake her sense of foreboding. The trail north led through increasingly wooded terrain, the pines growing thicker as the land began to rise toward the mountains. Ruby kept her mare at a steady pace, constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. She knew Reed was somewhere behind her, far enough back to remain unnoticed by anyone watching for her, but close enough to intervene if needed. After about 2 miles, the trail forked. Martha had said to take the left path, which appeared less traveled. Ruby hesitated, then continued as instructed, though her apprehension grew with each passing minute. The cabin, when she finally spotted it through the trees, was small and appeared neglected. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cool autumn air, and no horse was visible in the crude lean-to that served as a stable. Ruby reined in her mare at the edge of the clearing, every sense alert for danger. The door of the cabin opened, and Martha appeared, waving urgently. "Hurry. She's getting worse." Ruby took a deep breath and nudged her horse forward. If this was indeed a trap, she had already committed to springing it. Reed would be watching, and she had to trust in his ability to help her if things went wrong. As she dismounted and gathered her supplies, Martha hovered anxiously. "Thank you for coming. Sarah's been in pain for hours." Ruby followed the woman to the cabin door, noting the absence of any sounds that would indicate a woman in labor. No moans of pain, no murmured comforts from a concerned husband. The silence was damning. She paused at the threshold, her hand instinctively reaching for the small Derringer pistol concealed in her pocket, a gift from Sheriff Matthews that she had accepted with reluctance, but now appreciated. "Where is your sister?" she asked, making no move to enter the darkened cabin. Martha's nervous manner suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold smile that transformed her face. "Inside," she said, her voice now lower, masculine. In one swift movement, she grabbed Ruby's arm and shoved her through the door. Ruby stumbled forward into the dim interior, recovering her balance just in time to see Oscar Blackwell rise from a chair near the hearth. The disguise was gone now, the wig and shawl discarded on the floor beside him. "Welcome, my dear," Blackwell said, his voice silky with triumph. "So good of you to come." Ruby backed away, reaching for her hidden pistol, but found her wrist caught in an iron grip. The person who had posed as Martha was a man she didn't recognize, one of Blackwell's hired thugs, she presumed. Now, Blackwell chided, noticing her attempt to reach her weapon. "Let's not make this unpleasant. James, relieve Miss Anderson of whatever she's reaching for." The thug roughly searched her pockets, finding and removing the Derringer as well as a small knife she kept for cutting herbs. "Armed were you," Blackwell said, his eyebrows rising. "How frontier of you." Ruby straightened her spine, refusing to show fear despite the rapid beating of her heart. "What do you want, Blackwell?" "What I've always wanted," he replied, moving closer. "You, Ruby. You were to be mine, and I don't surrender what's mine easily." "I was never yours," Ruby said firmly, "and I never will be." Blackwell's face darkened. "Your father died owing me a fortune. You agreed to marry me to settle that debt." "Because you lied to me," Ruby countered. "You forged documents to create a debt that never existed. I heard you admit it the night before our wedding." Surprise flickered across Blackwell's face before he masked it. "Eavesdropping were you, how unladylike, but it doesn't matter now. You're coming back to Pennsylvania with me, and we're going to be married as planned." "And if I refuse?" Ruby asked, already knowing the answer. Blackwell shrugged. "Then I'm afraid there will be unfortunate consequences for that charming little town you've adopted, particularly for your friend, Mr. Ainsworth." "You leave Reed out of this," Ruby demanded, fear for Reed overtaking her concern for herself. "Ah, so it's Reed, is it?" Blackwell said, his voice dangerously soft. "I saw your touching scene last night. The ring, the promises, how romantic." His face contorted with jealousy. "He's nothing, Ruby, a drifter, a man with no standing, no fortune, no future. What can he offer you that I cannot?" "Everything that matters," Ruby answered without hesitation. "Respect, freedom, love." Blackwell's hand struck out so quickly that Ruby had no time to dodge the blow. His palm connected with her cheek, snapping her head to the side with the force of the impact. "You ungrateful girl," he hissed. "After everything I've done for you," the cabin door burst open with a crash, flooding the dim interior with afternoon sunlight. Reed stood in the doorway, a rifle leveled at Blackwell's chest. "Touch her again," he said, his voice deadly calm, "and it will be the last thing you do." Blackwell froze, momentarily stunned by the interruption. The thug, James, reached for his weapon, but Reed was faster. The rifle barrel swung toward him. "Don't," Reed warned. Taking advantage of the distraction, Ruby wrenched herself free from the thug's loosened grip and moved quickly to Reed's side. "You followed more closely than I expected," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Couldn't risk losing sight of you," Reed replied, his eyes never leaving Blackwell. "Sheriff Matthews and his deputies are right behind me. It's over, Blackwell." Blackwell's face twisted with rage. "Nothing is over until I say it is," he snarled and lunged for the pistol on the table beside him. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Ruby saw Reed's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Blackwell's hand close around the revolver, heard the deafening report of a gunshot, and then chaos erupted. James charged Reed, knocking him sideways. The rifle discharged again, the bullet splintering wood somewhere in the ceiling. Ruby scrambled for the Derringer that had fallen to the floor in the commotion, her fingers closing around its grip just as Blackwell raised his pistol toward Reed, who was struggling with the larger man. "No," Ruby shouted and fired without hesitation. The small Derringer was meant for close range, and Ruby was no practiced shot. The bullet caught Blackwell in the shoulder rather than the chest, spinning him around with the impact. He staggered but didn't fall, his face a mask of disbelief as he looked at Ruby. "You shot me," he said, his voice filled with bewildered outrage. "You actually shot me." "I'll do worse if you try to hurt Reed," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. Outside, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, Sheriff Matthews and his deputies, arriving just as Reed had promised. Blackwell seemed to realize that his opportunity for escape was rapidly vanishing. With a snarl of fury, he raised his pistol again, this time aiming directly at Ruby. Reed, still grappling with James, saw the movement and reacted instinctively. Breaking free with a desperate surge of strength, he launched himself at Blackwell just as the man pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Ruby saw Reed collide with Blackwell, saw both men go down in a tangle of limbs, and then the cabin door burst open again as Sheriff Matthews and two deputies stormed in, weapons drawn. "Reed!" Ruby cried, dropping to her knees beside the fallen men. Blackwell was clearly unconscious, blood spreading from his shoulder wound, but Reed was frighteningly still, his eyes closed. "No, no, no," Ruby murmured, her hands moving frantically over his chest, searching for the wound. When she found it a spreading crimson stain just below his left shoulder, she pressed down hard, trying to stem the flow of blood. Sheriff Matthews knelt beside her, his weathered face grave as he assessed the situation. "Deputy, get the doctor," he ordered. "And fetch Miss Anderson's medical supplies from her horse." "I'm the closest thing to a doctor we have," Ruby said, her voice cracking with fear. "Reed needs help now. We have to get him back to town." The next hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. Reed, unconscious but alive, was carefully transported to town on a makeshift stretcher. Ruby worked alongside Doc Jenkins, who had indeed broken his ankle but could still direct the surgery to remove the bullet lodged near Reed's collarbone. Blackwell and his accomplice were locked in the town jail, both under guard while awaiting transportation to face charges Blackwell for attempted kidnapping and assault, as well as the financial crimes waiting for him in Pennsylvania, and James as his accomplice. It was nearly midnight when Ruby finally emerged from the room above the saloon that had been hastily converted into a surgery. Her dress was stained with Reed's blood, and her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes held hope as she faced the crowd of townspeople waiting for news. "He's alive," she announced, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. "The bullet missed his lung by less than an inch. He's lost a lot of blood, but if infection doesn't set in, he should recover." A collective sigh of relief swept through the gathered crowd. Mrs. Hollister stepped forward to embrace Ruby, who finally allowed herself to tremble now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You need rest, child," the older woman said gently. "You've done all you can for now." Ruby shook her head. "I need to stay with him. If he wakes when he wakes, I want to be there." No one argued with her determination. The townspeople gradually dispersed, each offering words of support or small gestures of kindness, a covered dish for later, a fresh pot of coffee, a promise to pray for Reed's recovery. Ruby was overwhelmed by their genuine concern, by the way this community had so completely embraced both her and Reed in such a short time. Inside the makeshift sickroom, Ruby settled into a chair beside Reed's bed. His face was unnaturally pale against the pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. The rise and fall of his chest was the most beautiful sight Ruby had ever seen. She took his hand in hers, her thumb tracing over the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "You can't leave me now, Reed Ainsworth," she whispered. "Not when we've only just found each other." The night passed slowly, with Ruby dozing intermittently but never leaving Reed's side. She changed his bandages, bathed his face with cool water to combat the fever that began to rise, and spoke to him constantly, believing on some level that he could hear her even in unconsciousness. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about the dreams she'd had before her father's death had changed everything. She described the kind of home she hoped they might build together in Wilson, the children they might have. She promised him a future if only he would fight to claim it. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the curtained window when Reed's eyelids finally flickered. Ruby, who had been changing his bandages, froze as she watched his face, hardly daring to hope. "Reed," she whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty until they found her face. "Ruby," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Are you hurt?" A laugh that was half sob escaped her. "Am I hurt? You're the one who decided to stop a bullet with your body, you fool." The corner of Reed's mouth lifted slightly. "Did it work?" "Yes, it worked," Ruby said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Blackwell's in jail along with his hired man. You saved my life." Reed's hand moved weakly, searching for hers. Ruby captured it between both of her own, pressing it against her heart. "Don't try to move, you've lost a lot of blood." "Worth it," Reed murmured, his eyelids already growing heavy again. "To keep you safe, worth anything." Ruby leaned down and pressed her lips gently to his forehead. "Sleep now," she whispered. "I'll be here when you wake." Reed's recovery was slow but steady. The bullet had done significant damage to muscle and tissue, but had missed vital organs and major blood vessels, a miracle, according to Doc Jenkins. Ruby divided her time between caring for Reed and attending to her duties as town midwife, often working to the point of exhaustion. The entire town rallied around them. Mrs. Hollister brought daily meals to the room above the saloon, where Reed continued to convalesce. Thomas Brennan and other men from town took over Reed's duties at the livery, ensuring his position would be waiting when he recovered. Sheriff Matthews kept them updated on the legal proceedings against Blackwell, who had been transported to Denver to await trial for his crimes in both Colorado and Pennsylvania. 2 weeks after the shooting, Reed was strong enough to be moved to more comfortable accommodations. Ruby had secured a small house on the edge of town, the very one she had been considering renting for her own use, and with help from half the men in Wilson, Reed was carefully transported to his new home. "Our home," Ruby corrected when Reed commented on the cozy 2-room structure. "If you want it to be," Reed, still pale but improving daily, reached for her hand as he sat propped up in the bed that dominated the main room. "I want nothing more," he said, his voice growing stronger each day. "Though I had planned to do this properly with a house I'd built myself, not one you had to secure while I was flat on my back." Ruby sat beside him on the edge of the bed, her fingers intertwining with his. "We can build something else later if you want, but for now this is perfect. It's just a few minutes' walk from my practice, big enough for the two of us," and she hesitated, then continued with a slight blush, "and close enough to town to be respectable but far enough for privacy." Reed's eyebrows rose at her implication. "Are you suggesting, Miss Anderson, that we live in sin?" Ruby laughed, relieved to see his sense of humor returning. "I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Mr. Ainsworth. Mrs. Hollister has already informed me that she considers herself my chaperone until you're well enough to make an honest woman of me." "And when might that be?" Reed asked, his tone light but his eyes serious as they held hers. Ruby sobered, understanding the real question beneath his teasing. "The Reverend can come whenever you're ready," she said softly. "I don't need a fancy wedding or a new dress, I just need you healthy and whole." Reed's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "1 week," he said. "Give me 1 more week to build my strength, and then, Ruby Anderson, I am going to marry you if I have to be carried to the church on a stretcher." Ruby turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss against his calloused skin. 1 week, she agreed. "Though I'd prefer you on your feet rather than a stretcher." 1 week stretched to 2 as Reed suffered a setback, a slight infection that left him feverish and weak for several days. Ruby nursed him through it with the same determination she brought to everything, refusing to leave his side even when Mrs. Hollister offered to spell her. "You're exhausting yourself," Reed protested one evening as Ruby changed his bandages for the 2nd time that day. "You can't keep this up and still tend to your other patients." "Watch me," Ruby replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Besides, you're my most important patient." Reed caught her hand as she finished securing the fresh bandage. "Ruby, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, unable to hide the fatigue that marked her features. Reed tugged gently, pulling her down until she was seated on the edge of the bed beside him. "We've spent our whole lives taking care of others," he said quietly. "You with your father, then as a midwife. Me with whatever odd jobs would put food on the table. When was the last time you let someone take care of you?" The question caught Ruby off guard. I don't know," she admitted. "Not since my mother died, I suppose." Reed nodded as if her answer confirmed something he already suspected. "That's what I want to give you, Ruby. Not just love, not just a home, but someone who puts you first, who makes sure you rest when you're tired, eat when you're hungry, smile when you're sad." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes. "That goes both ways, you know. I want to be that for you too." "I know," Reed said, his smile tender. "That's why we fit so perfectly. Two people who have spent their lives giving, finally finding someone who gives back just as much." Ruby leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "When did you get so wise?" "Getting shot concentrates the mind wonderfully," Reed replied with a hint of his usual humor. "Makes a man think about what truly matters." They were married on a crisp November morning, with the mountains freshly dusted with the season's first snow. Reed stood under his own power at the altar of Wilson's small church, though Ruby could see the effort it cost him in the tightness around his eyes. She wore a new dress, after all a gift from the women of the town who had pooled their resources to purchase the deep blue fabric, and then stayed up late sewing it to surprise her. The entire population of Wilson seemed to have crowded into the church. The Brennan family sat in the front row, their baby now a thriving 2-month-old sleeping peacefully in Olivia's arms. Mrs. Hollister dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Sheriff Matthews stood with uncharacteristic stiffness in his Sunday best. As Ruby walked down the aisle toward Reed, she was struck by the realization that the community surrounding them was exactly what both of them had been seeking for so long: a place to belong, people who cared, a true home. Reed's eyes never left her face as she approached, his expression a mixture of awe and deep contentment. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, he squeezed it gently, as if confirming that this moment was real and not a fever dream. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice filling the small church, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words of the ceremony washed over Ruby like a benediction. Each vow she spoke felt like a stepping stone on the path that had led her to this moment, from the frightened young woman fleeing an unwanted marriage to the confident healer who had found her place in the world. A place beside the man whose quiet strength and unwavering support had given her the courage to stop running and start building. "I, Ruby Anderson, take thee, Reed Ainsworth, to be my wedded husband," she said, her voice clear and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Reed's voice was equally steady as he repeated the same vows, his eyes never leaving hers. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger to join his mother's turquoise ring, his hands were gentle and sure, no longer weakened by illness. "By the power vested in me," the Reverend concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Reed's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise sealed before all their friends and neighbors. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Ainsworth, the cheers that erupted were deafening in the small space. The celebration that followed at the town hall lasted well into the evening. There was music, dancing, though Reed was under strict orders from Ruby not to overexert himself, and enough food to feed Wilson twice over. Ruby found herself passed from one well-wisher to another, accepting congratulations and advice in equal measure. As the night deepened and the festivities showed no sign of slowing, Reed appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist. "Had enough celebrating," he murmured in her ear. Ruby looked up at him, noting the fatigue beginning to show on his face despite his efforts to hide it. "More than enough," she agreed. "Let's go home." They slipped away with minimal fuss, despite Mrs. Hollister's knowing smile and Thomas Brennan's good-natured teasing. The walk to their small house took longer than usual, with Reed still not at full strength, but neither of them minded the leisurely pace. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the dark sky above the mountains. "Happy, Mrs. Ainsworth?" Reed asked as they approached their home. The name sent a thrill through Ruby. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "Though I'm worried you've overextended yourself today," Reed chuckled as he opened their front door. "I've been saving my strength for what matters," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that sent heat rushing to Ruby's cheeks. Before she could respond, Reed surprised her by scooping her into his arms, wincing slightly but determined as he carried her across the threshold. "Welcome home, my love," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room, which had been transformed in their absence. Ruby gasped as she took in the scene. Someone undoubtedly, one of their friends, had prepared the house for their return. The fireplace held a cheerful blaze that warmed the small space. Fresh flowers sat on the table despite the late season, and the bed was turned down invitingly, scattered with what appeared to be rose petals. "It seems our friends thought of everything," Reed said, his arms still around her waist. Ruby turned in his embrace, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "Are you sure you're strong enough for this?" she asked, concern mingling with desire as she studied his face. "We have a lifetime ahead of us, there's no rush." Reed's answer was to lower his mouth to hers in a kiss that was nothing like the chaste one they had shared in the church. This was a kiss of passion long restrained, of promises about to be fulfilled. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I have waited for you my entire life, Ruby Ainsworth," Reed said, his voice husky with emotion. "I don't intend to wait a moment longer." The late November morning was cold, frost etching delicate patterns on the window glass, but the bed was warm as Ruby woke in the circle of Reed's arms. For a moment she simply lay still, savoring the unfamiliar but exquisite sensation of skin against skin, of complete belonging. Reed's breathing shifted, telling her he was waking. His arms tightened around her before he'd even opened his eyes, as if making sure she was still there. "Good morning, wife," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Ruby smiled, turning to face him. "Good morning, husband." The word still felt new on her tongue, wonderful and strange. Reed's eyes, heavy-lidded with lingering sleep, studied her face. "Any regrets?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability beneath the question. "Only that we didn't meet sooner," Ruby replied, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "Though perhaps we weren't ready for each other until now." Reed captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I think you're right. Everything in my life, even the hardest parts, led me to Wilson. To you." They lay in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the sounds of the morning, a rooster crowing in the distance, the soft crackling of the fire Reed had rebuilt before returning to bed, the occasional call of a bird outside their window. "What shall we do today?" Ruby asked eventually. "I don't have any patients scheduled, and Thomas said he'd handle the livery for one more day." "We could stay right here," Reed suggested, his hand stroking lazily up and down her bare arm, "or we could discuss the future." Ruby propped herself up on one elbow, curious. "What about the future?" Reed's expression grew more serious. "I've been thinking about what comes next for us. The house is fine for now, but eventually we might want something larger, especially if—" He hesitated, then continued. "Especially if we have children." The thought sent a flutter of anticipation through Ruby's chest. "Children," she repeated softly. "I'd like that, not right away perhaps, but someday." "I'd like that too," Reed agreed, "and I've been thinking about work as well. Training horses for the livery is good, honest labor, but I've always wanted something of my own." "What did you have in mind?" Ruby asked, fascinated by this glimpse into dreams he hadn't yet shared. "Land," Reed said simply. "Not a huge ranch, but enough for a proper home, some cattle, good grazing, maybe an orchard. Wilson's growing, and there will always be a need for beef and fresh produce." He looked at her uncertainly. "What do you think?" Ruby considered the vision he was painting. "I think it sounds wonderful. Though I'd want to continue my work as a midwife, if possible." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Reed assured her. "Your healing skills are too valuable to Wilson and to me to set aside." Ruby leaned forward to kiss him, overwhelmed by his understanding of what her work meant to her. "Then yes," she said when they parted. "Let's build that future together, a home, land, children, all of it." Reed's smile was like the sunrise, gradual but transformative. "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "Building something lasting never is." "The best things rarely come easily," Ruby replied, settling back against his chest. "But they're always worth the effort." The winter of 1875–76 proved to be one of the harshest in Colorado's history. Heavy snows isolated Wilson for weeks at a time, forcing the community to rely on each other more than ever. Ruby's medical skills were in constant demand as colds, influenza, and frostbite afflicted the townspeople. Reed, fully recovered from his wound by January, worked tirelessly to keep the roads to outlying homesteads clear and to ensure the town's livestock survived the bitter cold. News from the outside world was sporadic, arriving with infrequent supply wagons or occasional riders brave enough to make the journey from larger settlements. In February, Sheriff Matthews received word that Oscar Blackwell had been convicted of multiple counts of fraud and attempted kidnapping. The judge had sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison, a vindication that brought Ruby a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. "He can't hurt us anymore," she told Reed the night they received the news. "Any of us." Reed, who had been reading by the fire, set down his book. "Are you relieved?" "Yes," Ruby said, settling onto the rug beside his chair, "but also sad in a way. Blackwell was a man of intelligence and means. He could have done so much good in the world if he'd chosen a different path." Reed reached down to stroke her hair, his touch gentle. "That's what separates people like him from people like you, Ruby. You see possibility where others see only profit. You build where others would destroy." Spring arrived late but gloriously, transforming the valley almost overnight. The hills erupted in wildflowers, and the creek that ran through Wilson swelled with snowmelt from the mountains. Ruby found herself increasingly busy as several babies decided to make their appearances with the new season, keeping her riding from homestead to homestead at all hours. It was after one such delivery, a difficult breech birth that had kept her at the Peterson farm for nearly 20 hours, that Ruby returned home to find Reed deep in conversation with Sheriff Matthews at their kitchen table. "Ruby," Reed exclaimed, rising quickly to greet her. "We were starting to worry. How did it go with Mrs. Peterson?" "A healthy baby boy," Ruby reported, accepting the cup of coffee the sheriff poured for her with gratitude. "But it was touch and go for a while. What brings you here, Sheriff? Not trouble, I hope." Matthews and Reed exchanged a look that immediately put Ruby on alert. "Not trouble," the sheriff assured her. "Actually, it might be good news, depending on how you look at it." Reed took Ruby's hand, leading her to the table. "You remember the Donovan property north of town? The old homestead that's been abandoned since John Donovan passed last fall?" Ruby nodded. The Donovan place had been one of the first homesteads in the valley, with good water access and fertile soil, but isolated enough that no one had been eager to take it on after the owner's death. "His daughter in Kansas City has decided to sell," Reed continued, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. 200 acres, including the house and outbuildings." Ruby began to understand the direction of the conversation. "And you're interested in buying it?" "We are," Reed corrected. "If you agree, it would be a stretch financially, but with my savings and what we've put aside from your midwifery work. And the town might be willing to help," Sheriff Matthews added. "Wilson benefits from having a resident midwife and a good horse trainer." The town council discussed offering a loan to help secure your services permanently. Ruby was momentarily speechless, touched by the community's support and excited by the possibility Reed was suggesting. The Donovan property was exactly the kind of place he had described on their first morning as husband and wife, large enough for cattle, with good grazing land and even a small orchard that had been John Donovan's pride and joy. "The house would need work," Reed admitted, correctly interpreting her silence as consideration rather than rejection. "But it's solid. 4 rooms, a good root cellar, barn needs a new roof, but the structure is sound. And it's only 4 miles from town, Sheriff Matthews pointed out. Close enough for your patients to reach you, or for you to reach them, Mrs. Ainsworth. Ruby looked at Reed, saw the hope in his eyes that he was trying to temper in case she wasn't ready for such a significant step. When can we see it? She asked simply. Reed's face broke into a grin that made him look boyish despite his 30 years. Tomorrow, if you'd like. Sheriff Matthews has the key. The Donovan property exceeded Ruby's expectations. The house, while in need of repairs and a thorough cleaning, was twice the size of their current home. The land stretched in a gentle slope from the foothills down to a year-round stream, with meadows that would provide excellent grazing. The orchard, though neglected, still showed signs of life with buds forming on the apple and cherry trees. As they walked the property boundaries, Reed pointed out where he envisioned building corrals for horses, where cattle would graze in summer, where they might plant a vegetable garden near the house. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Ruby found herself adding her own ideas: a herb garden for her medicinals, perhaps a small office where she could see patients without them having to travel all the way to town. By the time they returned to the house, their decision was made. It's perfect, Ruby said, taking in the weathered but sturdy structure that could become their home. Exactly what we've been talking about. Reed pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. Are you sure? It's a big commitment. I'm sure, Ruby said, laughing as he set her down. This is where we're meant to be, Reed. I can feel it. They signed the papers the following week, becoming the proud owners of the Donovan now Ainsworth Ranch. The work of transforming the property into their vision began immediately, with Reed dividing his time between the livery in town and the endless tasks at the ranch. The townspeople proved as good as their word, with Thomas Brennan and several other men volunteering their labor to help repair the barn roof and fix the sagging porch on the house. Ruby continued her midwifery practice while overseeing the transformation of the house interior. Mrs. Hollister organized a work party of town women who descended on the Ainsworth Ranch armed with scrub brushes, soap, and determination. By the end of a single day, the house had been cleaned from top to bottom, curtains hung at freshly washed windows, and Ruby's few pieces of furniture arranged in their new home. They moved in officially on the first day of June, exactly 7 months after their wedding. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wild roses from the untamed bushes that had once been John Donovan's wife's pride and joy. After a simple supper at their new table, Reed led Ruby outside to the porch where 2 rocking chairs, a house-warming gift from Sheriff Matthews, waited side by side. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, the mountains standing like sentinels against the fading light. Happy? Reed asked, settling into one chair as Ruby took the other. Completely, she replied, reaching across to take his hand. Are you? Reed nodded, his expression contemplative as he gazed out over the land that was now theirs. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted. After the war, after what happened with the railroad, I'd given up on the idea of putting down roots anywhere. And now, Ruby prompted when he fell silent. Reed turned to her, his eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else. You've given me a home, Ruby, not just this place, he gestured toward the house and land, but here. He placed their joined hands over his heart. Ruby's throat tightened with emotion. That goes both ways, she said softly. You're my home too, Reed Ainsworth, my fire and my shelter. Reed's smile was tender as he recognized his own words from the night they first met. We've come full circle, he observed. From strangers helping a family in need to building our own family. The word family hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility. Ruby had been planning to wait for a special moment to share her news, but suddenly this quiet evening, with just the 2 of them and the land that would nourish their future, seemed perfect. Speaking of family, she said, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. There's something I need to tell you. Reed straightened in his chair, his expression instantly alert. Is everything all right? Ruby smiled, squeezing his hand reassuringly. Everything is wonderful, but our family may be growing sooner than we planned." She placed her free hand over her abdomen in a gesture as old as womankind. "I'm quite certain I'm with child, Reed, due around Christmas by my calculations." For a moment, Reed seemed frozen, his eyes wide with shock, then a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. "A baby, we're having a baby." Ruby nodded, tears of joy welling in her eyes at his evident delight. "Are you happy about it?" "I know we talked about waiting." Her words were cut off as Reed rose from his chair and pulled her to her feet, wrapping her in a gentle but fervent embrace. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he whispered against her hair. "A child, Ruby, our child." They stood together on the porch as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared above the mountains. Reed's hand rested protectively over Ruby's still flat abdomen, as if already sheltering the tiny life growing within. "I love you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Both of you." Ruby leaned into his strength, feeling more secure and cherished than she had ever imagined possible. "And we love you," she replied, "our protector, our home." As darkness settled fully over the Ainsworth ranch, they remained on the porch, talking quietly of the future of the child that would join their family at year's end, of the dreams they had for the land, of the life they would build together in this place that had welcomed them both when they most needed somewhere to belong. Inside Ruby, the new life they had created together grew stronger each day, a testament to the love that had blossomed between two wounded souls who had found in each other not just passion and companionship, but the healing power of being truly known and accepted. And when December arrived, bringing with it a gentler winter than the previous year, Ruby gave birth to a son they named James Thomas Ainsworth, James for Reed's father, and Thomas in honor of the friend who had helped them in their time of need. The years that followed brought more children: a daughter, Sarah, born in the spring of 1878, and twin boys, William and Henry, who arrived unexpectedly in the summer of 1880, testing even Ruby's considerable midwifery skills with their determination to enter the world simultaneously. The Ainsworth Ranch prospered as Reed's careful management and hard work transformed the once abandoned property into one of the most productive in the valley. Ruby continued her healing work, training several young women in midwifery and herbal medicine, ensuring that Wilson would never again be without medical care. They faced challenges, of course, drought years that tested their resources, illnesses that frightened them when they struck their children, the normal strains of building a life together in a still wild land. But through it all, they remained each other's constant support, their love deepening with shared joys and weathered storms. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Reed surprised Ruby with a gift, a new sign at the entrance to their property. "Ainsworth Ranch," it read, and beneath that, in smaller letters, "Fire and Home." "Do you remember?" Reed asked as they stood together looking at the sign, their 4 children playing nearby under the watchful eye of Mrs. Hollister, who had become an honorary grandmother to the entire brood. "Of course I remember," Ruby replied, leaning against his side as his arm circled her waist. "It was the moment I stopped running and started building." Reed pressed a kiss to her temple, his love for her as evident now as it had been on their wedding day. "And look what you've built, my Ruby. A home, a family, a legacy." Ruby looked around at the ranch that had flourished under their care, at their children healthy and happy in the mountain sunshine, at the man beside her who had kept every promise he'd ever made to her. "We built it together," she corrected gently. "Just as we'll continue to do for all the years to come." And as the Colorado sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson above the mountains, Reed and Ruby Ainsworth stood together on the land they loved, surrounded by the family they had created, secure in the knowledge that they had finally found what both had sought for so long: a place to belong, a love to sustain them, and the warmth of fire and home.